家好，欢迎来到日视频，我是 Jennifer。美国经过了人口普查和总统大选之后呢，许多地方面临着选区重划的问题。美国少数族裔媒体服务中心3月26日举行线上座谈会，跟大家解读一下选区重划，少数族裔会面临着哪些利弊。请看详细报道。
We recognize that redistricting, as important as it is, and I'll talk a bit about that, only happens once every 10 years. So it's easy for folks, even folks like you, who are paying attention to all the important occurrences in public policy, to forget how redistricting works, how we go through it, its importance, because it only happens once every 10 years. So we are working together, the four of us, to explain some of the background. And our goal at the end of our presentations is to convey, first, how important redistricting is. The decisions made through the redistricting process can determine not just policy makers, but really determine policy made over the course of an entire decade. Second, to convey that this is a process political in nature, but that really must involve vigorous community input and organizing. Our communities, particularly communities of color, can take advantage of what the census shows in growth of our communities through the redistricting process, but only if they have the opportunity and take that opportunity to provide input to the line drawers about how districts should be drawn. And third, we want to convey how important and central the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its imperatives are in the redistricting process. As Leah will explain, the Voting Rights Act is really the central legal consideration in drawing lines through redistricting. And the imperative under the Voting Rights Act to create majority-minority districts is a central element of what every line drawing community will take into account. I want to emphasize that majority-minority districts does not refer to the race of the candidates elected, though it is certainly true that majority-minority districts often elect candidates from the community of color that is the majority. But the focus is really on the community, and specifically on ensuring that the choice in that district is one supported by voters from the minority community that represents the majority created through redistricting in that district. I start where Sandy started, which is with the census. As you all know, we've just come out of our decennial practice in the United States of attempting to count every person through every household in the United States. Now, we had some hiccups, as you all are certainly aware, with the 2020 census. First and foremost, there were delays in doing the non-response follow-up by the Bureau because of the pandemic. But I should also note that the Trump administration's ongoing attempts to politicize the collection of data through the census also created obstacles to, first of all, getting a complete count, and second of all, to the Bureau in putting together the data to then release for use in redistricting, among other purposes. That politicization included, as you all are aware, the attempt to include a citizenship question. And although that was defeated, the Trump administration then ordered the Bureau to divert attention and resources to creating, through administrative records, a database of citizens. That too, because of the Biden administration, has now gone away. And finally, you may recall that President Trump in 2020 ordered the Bureau to provide him with data to enable him to subtract the undocumented immigrant population from the apportionment count. That too diverted Census Bureau resources from completing the post-processing necessary to take the data collected from households in 2020 and to create the data that is released to be used in redistricting and for other purposes. First, I want you to understand that there are only two purposes for the census that derive from the US Constitution. One of them is explicitly in our Constitution, and the other derives from the Constitution through its interpretation by the US Supreme Court. The first and only explicit use of the census in the Constitution is for reapportionment. Reapportionment is the reallocation of the 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives among the states. Now, that number of 435 is not established by the Constitution. It could be changed by the Congress and President at any time they wished. But we have had that number, 435, for many decades. But with the population changes shown by the census every 10 years, we reallocate those seats. And the states that have grown relatively more quickly than others will gain seats. And those who have gained population at a slower rate will lose seats. Not a surprise to many of you, I assume, but this year projections say that Texas and Florida may gain the most, more than one seat, through that reallocation of seats in the House of Representatives. A decade ago, similarly, the Texas was the big winner, gaining 4 new seats in the House of Representatives. One issue that may arise this year is that California might, we're on the cusp, might lose a seat in the House of Representatives for the very first time in that state's history. Now, the apportionment count ordinarily would be available at the end of the year of the census, so December of 2020. But because of the delays and the causes I identified earlier, we won't have the data from the Census Bureau on total state population and how that translates into reallocating the 435 seats in the House of Representatives until the end of April. This will slow down our knowing, specifically in the states that gain or lose, what the line drawers will have to do with respect to congressional districts. Will they be drawing the same number of districts as before, or adding 1 or 2 or 3, or will they be losing 1? So we won't even know until the end of April what our line drawers state by state will have to do. Now the second, let me go back. The apportionment is the explicit purpose of the census in our US Constitution. The Constitution says we should enumerate our population every 10 years solely to determine representation in the House of Representatives. So that is the one explicit constitutional use of the census to reassign seats in the House of Representatives. Redistricting, which is different from reapportionment, is derived from the Constitution through Supreme Court decision. Redistricting is the redrawing of district lines, not just for Congress, but also for state legislatures, also for local bodies like city councils, county boards, boards of education, community college boards, where those systems elect their representatives by districts rather than at large. The reason we go through a redistricting process, which we didn't in this country before the 1960s, there were many states that didn't redraw their lines for decades and decades prior to the 1960s. But in the 1960s, through a series of cases, the US Supreme Court concluded that it's a violation of our Constitution not to equalize districts in population every 10 years. The result of not redrawing lines prior to the 1960s meant that in certain states, state Senate seats or state House seats would differ dramatically in the number of people living within them, often to the detriment of urban areas over rural areas. And indeed, some states followed a model like the United States Senate and would assign state Senate seats to counties or other entities not based on population. But in the 1960s, the US Supreme Court concluded, in a doctrine that has, unfortunately, because it's not an indication of what the doctrine necessarily says, but through a doctrine that's become known as one person, one vote, the Supreme Court concluded that each state and each locality must redraw their lines after the census to make the districts relatively equal in population. I say relatively equal because there is some leeway for distinctions, for differences deviations from total population equality. Historically, congressional districts have had to be as equal as possible, meaning that literally there would be only one person difference in population between congressional districts within a particular state. However, in that series of cases in the 1960s and thereafter, the Supreme Court has given greater leeway for deviations from total population equality for other districts, like state Senate seats, like state House seats, like local city council seats. So the line drawers will be looking to equalize within those guidelines the districts that they are drawing. What that means is that the census indications of the communities, including communities of color, that have grown the most will translate or should translate into greater representation through majority minority districts and or districts that include significant populations so as to influence electoral outcomes. I want to mention one challenge that has not yet appeared, but may appear somewhere in the country through the redistricting process. And that is, I mentioned previously that President Trump sought to create a database of citizens in the country. The sole purpose of doing that was to permit any jurisdiction that sought to draw districts to equalize citizen voting age population rather than total population. This is a movement from the right wing that has existed for many years. It culminated several years ago in a case that went to the US Supreme Court called Evanwell versus Abbott, in which the plaintiff contended that the state of Texas was required to equalize citizen voting age population rather than total population in drawing districts. The Supreme Court rejected that contention. But because of the case before it, it technically left open the possibility that a jurisdiction could voluntarily choose to equalize districts based on voter population rather than total population. That has been made more difficult because the Biden administration has eliminated the creation of a citizen database that goes down to block level. And that data is necessary to draw districts. In a moment, you'll hear from Terry Alminis specifically about how census blocks are used. But that danger that I mentioned has been diminished because there will not be data available at census block level that reflects citizenship. I will simply close by noting that if any jurisdiction were to attempt to equalize its districts based on voter population rather than total population, that would have a devastating effect on communities of color for two reasons. First, because many communities of color, particularly Latino and Asian American communities, have higher proportions of non-citizens. But it would also, and perhaps its greatest harm, would come from the exclusion of every person under the age of 18 in equalizing district populations. And all communities of color have higher proportions of those under 18 than white populations. So that was the danger, ameliorated, as I said, by the non-existence of the data to do this work. So that's an introduction to where the redistricting process comes from the census, from Supreme Court mandate.
And Tom mentioned that the Voting Rights Act is really central to the redistricting process. And the Voting Rights Act is this beautiful statute that Justin and Tom and myself and maybe you love very much. We are suffering, though, an impediment going into this next round of redistricting because in 2013, the US Supreme Court immobilized Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is the heart of the Voting Rights Act. This is the provision that would have required some states, some localities to pre-clear, to get federal approval before they could implement redistricting plans. In some of the places where we have a record that elected officials use the redistricting process to try to entrench themselves in power and diminish the ability of Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and other voters to participate. So they immobilized that provision, and this will be the first time we go into redistricting without places like Georgia or Texas or Louisiana having to get federal approval of their maps and show the government that they are not making it worse off for communities of color to participate. Now, that is a huge loss, and it requires us to therefore be very engaged in this next round of redistricting, which is why it's exciting that you all are talking and thinking about it and going to publicize it. But it can't just be us, and it can't just be you. It has to be everyone, because there are thousands of jurisdictions. Redistricting is done at every level of government, from Congress to legislative bodies, to city councils, to county commissions, to school boards, to water boards, and other legislative bodies. And so we need to be in the room when people are considering how they're going to redraw the lines. Now, I mentioned that we lost a core provision of the Voting Rights Act, but the Voting Rights Act is still vibrant. And there is another provision called Section 2 that I'm going to focus on. While Section 5 functioned as a shield to prevent dilutive redistricting plans, Section 2 is like a sword. You go in after a map has been passed and try to poke holes in it, or frankly, you want to kill a bad map if we can, and not about violence, but we need to take down some bad maps when we can. And Section 2 is used to do that. And it's used to attack dilutive redistricting plans, which is just a form of manipulating the lines, again, to entrench people in power. So vote dilution occurs when an election system or a redistricting scheme, when they keep the same one or they adopt a new one, whether they're intending to do it or it just has the results of ensuring that minority voters, which tend to be voters of color, do not have the same opportunity and equal opportunity as do the majority of voters, usually white voters, but not always, to elect their candidate of choice. Now, Tom mentioned that there's no right to have a Black or Latino candidate. They're similar. It's the right to elect the candidate of your choice, regardless of race. It may be the race of the community of voters, but it may not be. And even more, this provision doesn't guarantee electoral success. It just guarantees that the lines are drawn in a fair enough way that voters of color have a chance in the process. Whereas if you manipulate the lines, no matter how you vote, it won't matter in terms of the redistricting and the ability to elect. Vote dilution typically arises in the context of something called at-large elections. Now, these are not sexy terms. A lot of times we've never heard of these things, but they're very important. And at-large elections are when 50% plus one of the voters, the majority of voters, again, usually white voters, they control the outcome of the elections for all the seats on a particular body. They just control the entire pie. Vote dilution can also occur when you crack voters of color among various electoral districts so that you avoid creating those majority-minority districts that Tom says the Voting Rights Act requires under the appropriate circumstances. Vote dilution also occurs when you pack voters of color into what we sometimes refer to as super majority-minority districts. That's district where Black voters, for example, are like 70%, 80%, 90% of the voting age population. And that's because you're trying to avoid creating multiple districts where they can have multiple chances to elect their candidates of choice. One of the leading cases that sort of governs all this is Thornburg versus Jingles. And everyone's free time, maybe this weekend, you can look up this 1986 case by the Supreme Court. It sets out the standard that we have to use in order to demonstrate that vote dilution is occurring. And what it does is puts the burden on minority voters. And this is what's different under Section 2 than Section 5. Under Section 5, the burden was on the government to show that they weren't making it worse off for voters of color. Under this provision that we're left with, Section 2, minority voters and organizations like MALDEF and AAJC and the Legal Defense Fund, and Justin when he was at the Department of Justice, but even in his capacity now, it requires us to work with communities to do three things first. Propose an illustrative map in which the minority community is the numerical majority in a geographically compact area of the entire plan. So you have to propose an illustrative map. This doesn't have to be the ultimate map, but it's just to show that it's possible to draw minority communities, minority voters who share things in common in a way that will allow them the chance to elect their candidate of choice. The other two pieces that you have to show is the fact that you need this district because minority voters, they usually vote together as a block for candidates. So they cast their votes similarly for certain candidates. But because they're the minority, the white community tends to vote for different candidates. And as the minority, the majority community's voting preferences, they overwhelm the voting preferences of the minority community. This is called racially polarized voting. It's a term of art that you're likely to hear, or racial block voting. You should get used to it because that data is very necessary. Those voting patterns are key evidence that we need to have in order to show that the types of plans and maps and majority minority districts that we propose, that they're necessary. How does racially polarized voting work? So in a 5-member at-large city council, in a city that's 40% Black and 60% white, Black people run for office, but they never get more than 10% of white voter support. That is 6% of the total vote, but they always get 90% of Black voter support. So under this system and under those voting patterns, the candidates preferred by the white community, by white voters, they win no matter how much support Black voters give for their candidates, no matter the political affiliation or the qualifications or any of the other circumstances, they control the outcome. And in our country, race remains a great predictor of how people continue to cast their ballots. So if all of those conditions are met, the burden then remains on minority voters to say that this structure and these voting patterns are operating in a larger circumstance in which there's a history of discrimination in that community, in which the ability to participate in the political process, whether that is to vote, whether that is to run as a candidate, that all of that is affected by lower socioeconomic status, the discrimination in education, both private and public, that has made it more difficult for Black candidates to compete, or Latino candidates to compete, or Black voters to be able to participate politically. It also requires showing that the lines, or it can require showing that the lines that the elected bodies have drawn, that those lines don't have to be that way, that they are using excuses for those lines. Some of the excuses are, it's party, I'm drawing this district to protect my party. And one thing that's really important to understand is that if you hurt minority voters on the way to ensuring that your party wins, or you use political data and it happens to have a harmful impact on minority communities, our Constitution should help rein that in. And we should be wary of those excuses because they're basically excuses for racial discrimination. One last thing I'll say before I close, or two last things, so I always overpromise. Another defense that you're likely to hear, and Justin's going to really tease this out, is it's not possible to create that illustrative compact district of where Black voters or Latino voters can form a numerical majority without you racially discriminating by sort of lassoing out and pulling every voter of color into that district to meet that number. The unfortunate reality of some of this work is that we are drawing lines around where people live, and some of that's related to segregation and housing discrimination, but it also we're drawing it around people who share schools in common. They read the same newspapers, they're members of the same political organizations. So the idea behind it is they have things in common, which means they need to be in a district where their votes will allow them to elect representatives who will make policies that will then speak to their shared interests. That's the sort of theoretical underpinning of this. And my final piece that I want to mention is that not only when you're drawing these maps and considering all these considerations, must you you generally have to, as a first priority, you have to make sure that your districts, to Tom's point, have as equal populations between them as possible, that you're not putting thousands of voters in one district and very few voters in another. That's one of your first priorities. The next priority, sort of, or equal to that, is complying with the Voting Rights Act and making sure you're not diluting the minority community. Along the way, you should be accounting for what are called traditional redistricting principles, such as making sure that you keep districts connected to one another, that you keep communities intact, that you try to protect incumbents where possible. But I want us all to understand that nothing matters more than complying with the Constitution, equalizing the populations between districts, and ensuring the non-dilution of racial minorities in districts. No map can avoid those requirements under the law, and when they do, we go to court, and otherwise we try to defeat them.
I want to also lift up two things that Leah said before going on to the other stuff very briefly. One, we are committed to minority rights in this broader system of majority rule. And the notion that the Voting Rights Act is the most important law we have ensuring that is incredibly important to say early and often. It has gotten harder to enforce, as she mentions, but there is legislation that all of us very much hope will be on the way, restoring it. And so part of the stories that you're going to want to publish will also have to do with the continuing fight and how hard it is to bring and win these cases now, despite this powerful law, and the means to restore it coming up in the future. The second thing I want to lift up is local redistricting. It's not just the states that are drawing state legislative lines or federal lines, but as Leah mentioned, a lot of this work and a lot of the damage to minority communities will happen at the local level for school boards and city council and county commission. So the more work that you can do to get the word out there, the better. Leah mentioned the Voting Rights Act, and that is a way to make sure that we pay enough attention to racial and ethnic minority requirements, to making sure that there's real opportunity. There's also, you will hear the allegation of improper uses of race. This is some of the pushback she mentioned. And you'll hear talk about racial gerrymandering. The Constitution says that race can only predominate in drawing a district if there's a really good reason for it. But that is more often an excuse than a real limitation. What the Constitution forbids is focusing single-mindedly on race. But considering race, acknowledging race, considering ethnicity, all of that is fine and has been repeatedly held to be fine. The analogy I use is we all know it's important not to speed. And if when you're driving, the only thing you're looking at is your speedometer, you're going to crash. But none of us do that. We look at the speedometer to make sure we're not speeding, but we also look at the road and the traffic and the weather and the GPS and the radio and the heat and the gas gauge. And the same is true in redistricting. If you consider race and ethnicity and also other factors at the same time, that's perfectly legally permissible and in many cases required. Leah also mentioned this fight between race and ethnicity or party. In a number of cases last cycle, the Supreme Court took states to task for staring too much at the speedometer, for using race as a pretext and focusing on race without considering other things. At the same time, it said it was okay, or at least said federal courts wouldn't get involved with drawing lines to benefit party. And in this zone, sometimes you'll hear the excuse that it's very hard to tell which is which, that those seem like the same thing. In some states, that may be true, that it's really hard to tell whether politicians are focusing on race or focusing on party, if there really is incredibly stark polarization. But in other states, it may not be true. In many parts of the near South, in many parts of the South, and many parts of the West, polarization isn't so severe that it's impossible to tell when map drawers are focusing on race or party. There will be differences in focusing on race or party. And entities like MALDEF and like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and like AAJC are out there ready to make sure that map makers are not focusing, like staring through the steering wheel at race, particularly when that's used to injure a racial population or an ethnic population. For you in your reporting, I want to make 2 more points, and then I want to get to questions to leave plenty of time for your questions. I saw they're really good questions in the comments. First of all, when talking about Congress or state lines, in most states, the legislature has the primary control. The legislature's in charge mostly. But that process is not always the normal process. Sometimes there are supermajority requirements or specific ways in which bills go forward. Sometimes the governor is locked out of the redistricting process, like in North Carolina. And then there are several states, the ones in gold here, where somebody other than the legislature is primarily in charge. So when you're doing this reporting, don't just assume that it's the legislature that is driving the train. The second thing is that there are lots of other things for map drawers to consider, in addition to population, which Tom mentioned, in addition to the Voting Rights Act and racial and ethnic rules, which Leah mentioned. Those rules all differ state by state. And I'm not going to get into the details of exactly what happens in each state here, but I help maintain a website that actually breaks down this process in every single state. Who's in charge, what the rules are, what the timing is, what happened last cycle and the cycle before. And so all about redistricting may help answer some of the questions you have for a baseline about what the rules are in the particular state where you may be covering the redistricting process.
I just wanted to was going to start with where Tom started us today with respect to the census through redistricting. And I know that some of these concepts were discussed. So the redistricting data file will not be coming out on a timely fashion for all the reasons that Tom mentioned earlier. Insofar, and when I say timely fashion, I mean according to when it normally would have come out. It is now slated to come out at the end of September. But I think what's important for us to think about is understanding what is actually in that redistricting file and how the redistricting process happens, so that everybody is ready to go, if you will, when the data drops, and that people are doing and taking steps now today to prepare themselves for that moment. So we're talking about redistricting of the different political district boundaries and at all the different levels, as I remember Tom had discussed. And again, why is it important? How the district lines are drawn influences who runs for public office, who is elected, and also who lives in the district can influence whether the elected officials are in fact responsive to our community's needs regarding important issues like ensuring safe schools, adopting immigration policies, and the like. So the redistricting data. Public Law 94-171, which was enacted in 1975, directs the Census Bureau to make special preparations to provide redistricting data needs to the states, right? So the PL 94-171 file, also known as the PL file or the redistricting file, will provide population data by race, Latino origin, and for those who are 18 years and older. What's also important to know about the data is that the data will be provided down to the census block level, and this is the smallest geographic unit for data provided by the Census Bureau. When we think about census blocks, we need to understand that they are statistical areas bound by visible features such as roads, streams, and railroad tracks, and by non-visible boundaries such as property lines, city, township, school districts, county limits, and other factors. As I mentioned, census blocks are the smallest geographic unit, and you can think of them as the building blocks for all the geographic boundaries that the Census Bureau data sets will use. For the 2010 census, there was a total number of census blocks of over 11 million, but important to note that almost 5 million actually represented census blocks that had no population in them, that is zero population. So in the remaining 56% of the census blocks, the range of the populated blocks was from 1 person to almost 20,000 persons. So there's a lot of variation and variety with respect to the size of these different census blocks. And the reason why this is important is because how the actual redistricting occurs is that the mappers will take these census blocks and combine them together to create the districts that match the number, right, of units or seats for that level of government. So the example, right, is if you had 36 congressional seats, then you would have to draw 36 districts, and you would need to draw them in a way that meets the different criteria that have been discussed so far today, as well as others. And so if you look at the image on this slide, you'll note, right, that if you wanted to consider the first block on the left as the entire governmental unit that you need to redistrict, and you're looking to redistrict for 3 districts, you can tell that while all of the blocks in the districts in the other 2 diagrams, they have the same number of blocks in them, but the configuration is different. And so this really gets to what, you know, I know Leah was discussing about compliance with the Voting Rights Act. This is sort of how you can visually see how that can come into play. Why the community needs to be involved, right, is because redistricting can be used for bad or for good, right? And really that is really about whether our communities are excluded or whether they are actually included in getting the fair share of their political power. So it is really critical that our communities fully participate in and monitor the upcoming redistricting process to ensure our communities are heard and represented. So just quickly around the timing, as we mentioned, the data will not be provided until September 30th. And this really is putting a squeeze on the redistricting process in every state. And, you know, I won't go through all the different ways the states could potentially try to address these issues, particularly where you have situations where this delay will make it impossible for the states to actually meet their redistricting deadlines. But I think the big takeaway from this is that the potential, one of the potential problems of for the delay that we're concerned about is that the time crunch could actually be used as an excuse by some jurisdictions to actually minimize or truncate the opportunity for the public to be involved in the redistricting process. And so that is something that we are certainly on the lookout for and need to make sure does not happen. Right now, what people can do is make sure that they understand how the redistricting will be happening where they live, right? The process will be different. So learn the rules, organize your community, right? Get together with interested neighbors or organizations to work together to really, you know, understand what the community looks like and what the community wants and needs. This could result in potentially drafting maps that best represent your community's interests that could then be shared in these public hearings and whatnot. And then finally, make sure to be engaged with the public participation process, testify at the hearings, whether that's testifying about a proposed map you have or just about what your community looks like, to make sure that your community's interests are heard and are part of the process. And with